Today I'll be talking about forest certification and timber legality regulation and recent trends in policy and practice around the world. Since about the 1980s or so, global awareness of land use and land cover changes has increased dramatically, particularly with regard to losses of tropical forests and associated implications, for example, for global biodiversity, the climate, and forest-dependent people. From a global study by Song, Hansen, and others, we can see that total tree cover actually increased by 2.24 million square kilometers globally, and there was a net loss in much of the tropics of forest and forest cover, though this was outweighed by gains in many temperate and boreal forest areas. But these losses have spurred a wide range, diversity and growing number of interventions and initiatives to address deforestation and forest degradation at many levels, from global to regional, national, subnational, across public, private, and civil society sectors. And these efforts originally many were focused on developing a binding global agreement on forest use, which has yet to be achieved despite important contributions. For example, the Agenda 21 Forest Principles from the Earth Summit in Rio in 1992, and further developments of a non-legally binding instrument on forests in 2007. But most of these efforts have not had the desired impact on deforestation and forest degradation globally at the regional level. For example, regionally agreed frameworks of criteria and indicators for measuring, monitoring, reporting on sustainable forest management have had very limited application and impact, particularly in the tropics, despite measurable advances in the legal frameworks on forests at national levels in many countries, including in the tropics. Continued limitations in their implementation and enforcement have contributed to ongoing challenges with forest governance. And forest certification, which we will explore more in this presentation, has had significant increase since its establishment by the FSC in the early 90s, but deforestation and forest degradation, particularly in the tropics, persist. So first, looking at forest certification, which was initially developed as a non-state market policy tool aiming to promote sound forest management or good forest management through private sector market-based incentives. And it has been designed to be a standardized process for evaluating and labeling products from well-managed forests based on widely agreed ecological, economic, and social principles, criteria, and indicators of forest sustainability, whereby the label for certification can inform buyers about the source and sustainability of certified products and permit recognition and reward of good forest management through purchase preference and price differentials. And the first global scheme of forest certification was developed by a coalition of private firms, civil society organizations, and community group leaders who came together to create the Forest Stewardship Council, largely out of frustrations from a lack of a globally agreed binding instrument on forests after the Earth Summit in Rio. And they came together to create the Forest Stewardship Council, which was established in 1993 to serve as a means for certifying good forest management and rewarding it through market-based incentives. The second major global scheme for certification was established in 1999 out of Europe in the Program for the Endorsement of Forest Certification, which endorses national and independent forest certifications, which number total 35 in the system currently today. And together, these two frameworks have increasingly certified well-managed forests globally since the early 1990s, today totaling some 455 million hectares of forests that have been certified globally, including about 95 million hectares that are dually certified between the two systems. But there is significant differentiation at regional levels between certified forest areas, certified forest units, and the chains of custody that have been certified as well. The large bulk of certified forest area and units are found in North America and Europe, with just about 10% of the combined total certified area globally being located in the tropics. And given that certification was at least initially evolved out of concerns for tropical deforestation and forest degradation, there are questions about how big of an impact it can have. And some of the obstacles to certification, particularly in the tropics, include persisting high costs associated with changes required for conventional tropical forest management to meet certification standards, and also incompatibility between certification standards and local legal forest frameworks, as well as certifications some limited accessibility to small and medium enterprises and community forest management, though these issues are being addressed through developments both in the Forest Stewardship Council and PEFC systems. Nevertheless, forest loss in the tropics persists, particularly in primary or unintervened forests. Data from WRI shows that forest loss has persisted over the last 2 decades at least. And despite some encouraging declines in tropical forest loss in primary forests in the mid-2010s, which is attributed in large part to decreasing deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon, evidence demonstrates that in recent years, since 2018, that deforestation in primary forests in the tropics is again on the rise. And so additional efforts and experiments with policy instruments and interventions have continued to develop, in part spurred by agreements made by G8 countries in 2001 to address violations of forest law and forest crime, in particular illegal logging associated illegal trade and corruption and their negative effects on the rule of law. A key new intervention or instrument has been demand-side policies in timber consumer countries to regulate timber imports and timber trade. The United States was the first country to establish a timber regulation for legal wood products, imports, and trade within the country by amending the U.S. Lacey Act, which is a 1900 law that bans the trafficking of illegal wildlife, and which was amended in 2008 to include also plants and plants products, specifically including timber, paper, and other forest products. The amendment requires customs declarations to include species and country of origin of timber and other forest products, and that due care is taken in determining the legality of imported and processed products, and makes it a criminal offense to falsify evidence of due care and documentation, and even a criminal offense to be in noncompliance or in violation without knowing. In 2010, the European Union established a similar regulation on timber imports and trade that prohibits the placing of illegally harvested timber and products that are derived from illegally harvested forests into the EU market. It requires importers practice due diligence similar to due care, but includes a more formalized or systematic approach to due diligence that includes information, risk assessment, and risk management in determining legality, and also requires traders maintain records for traceability along the supply chain or chain of custody. And it's the combination of the U.S. Lacey Act Amendment and the EU timber regulation in combination have had significant influence on the development of these types of regulations in many other countries, including Australia in 2012, followed by Japan and Korea and Mexico, and also countries that have voluntary partnership agreements or binding trade agreements with the European Union through its forest law enforcement governance and trade program have similar requirements on the imports of legal timber. And while these regulations differ slightly in how illegality is defined and how due diligence and due care is regulated, they all prohibit the placement of illegal timber within their jurisdictions and require domestic importers or traders and operators to demonstrate diligence or due care in sourcing legally produced wood products. Together, these are demand-side policies that aim to promote enhanced trade in legal wood products and also support the enforcement of sovereign forest laws in producer countries. And essentially, the theory of change for these types of policies is by reducing the demand or prohibiting illegal wood products, it increases the demand for legal products that are demonstrably legal and verifiable, and ultimately incentivizing more well-governed, legal, sustainable forest management. And many of these regulations on timber legality have been complemented or have synergies with certification and have driven further advances in timber legality and chain of custody verification. In terms of certification, certification of wood products can be used as evidence towards due diligence or due care requirements, but in most cases does not absolve any actor who may be found in non-compliance with due diligence requirements. But we have seen an increase in forest certification in many producer countries since the enactment of these regulations, particularly since the U.S. Lacey Act Amendment and the EU timber regulation coming into force. And there's also been growing development of third-party legality verification systems that verify the origin of legal timber, that also can verify legal compliance with legal frameworks at the national level in supplier countries, and verify the chain of custody from stump to marketplace. But these have had relatively slow acceptance and uptake, given that they, in and of themselves, do not demonstrate or not accepted as demonstration of due diligence or due care. And there's also been a plethora of tools for to assist with legality review and requirements that have been developed by different international organizations. And in terms of the impacts of timber legality regulations and also the verification of legality, in the US, there's evidence from studies that imports of illegal wood declined rather significantly with the onset of U.S. Lacey Act Amendment coming into force by as much as 32 to 44%. Other studies have shown that import volumes have decreased while import prices have increased from high-risk countries like Bolivia, Brazil, and other countries since the U.S. Lacey Act Amendment has been implemented. But also there are persisting high volumes of wood being imported from likely illegal sources, and these account for as much as 19 to 27% increase in the proportion of wood that is still imported. Although wood imports have decreased, the proportion of wood imported that comes from likely illegal sources has been shown by some studies to have increased by as much as 19 to 27%. And in terms of the implementation and enforcement of the Lacey Act Amendment, which is assigned to the USDA's APHIS agency, due care review on enforcement has been rather limited, largely given limitations in implementation resources, human resources, infrastructure, etc. But there has been the prosecution of several high-profile cases of noncompliance in the U.S. that are seen to be to serve as deterrents to noncompliance with the Lacey Act Amendment. And in the EU, there's evidence of imports shifting away from high-risk countries toward lower-risk, more viable sources of legal timber and other wood products, and that risk mitigation measures taken on by importers and producers have increased, largely through increases in sourcing certified wood or wood with Flag T licenses, which to date only comes from Indonesia. And in comparison to the United States implementation of the U.S. Lacey Act Amendment, compliance reviews of due diligence under the EU timber regulation are relatively high in some member countries. However, prosecutions are comparatively low, as are fines and other types of penalties. And also implementation and enforcement has been quite uneven across the member states of the European Union. Other issues with timber regulations and legality verification have to do with the leakage of illegally sourced wood, where there is evidence that low-risk wood products essentially are shifting to, or increasingly shifting to countries that have these types of timber regulations, and higher risk wood is simply shifting to markets without import measures or timber regulations. For example, some shift to the Chinese markets, and also timber derived from non-forestry, deforestation, forest conversion continues to be a source of timber supply that it's not controlled by these types of timber regulations. And as we can see from recent data by WRI, forest loss or deforestation that's driven by land use change for commodity production, principally agricultural production, remains to be a significant source of deforestation in Latin America and Southeast Asia. And so this conversion of forest and deforestation is considered to be some source of, provides some of the global timber supply, but is not regulated by the instruments and interventions that are currently in place. And so countries are starting to look at domestic policies or trade regulations that would prohibit the products or commodities that are grown on illegally deforested lands from entering their market, specifically the UK, United States and the European Union are currently developing options for these types of policies, and these will be taken up in the forthcoming Conference of Parties of the UNFCCC later this year in the UK. And as those types of policies expand, really demand-side regulations on timber, whether from forestry activities or non-forestry, forest conversion, are really only as effective as the enabling environment or the governance and enforcement in producer countries. And the onus remains through them to be on importers, traders, and operators. In addition, these types of regulations are really only as effective as their combined share of the global timber market. But as more countries adopt timber regulations for legal timber trade, and as their reach expands beyond the forestry sector to, for example, to prohibit products that may come from forest conversion, the reach of these types of instruments can expand. So thinking about the international forest regime complex, and particularly without a globally agreed binding mechanism for forest use and conservation, this expansion and adaptation or adaptiveness through new and multiple measures and instruments can continue to promote more transparent and responsible trade in forest products, and also contribute to a more well-governed and sustainably managed forest worldwide. Thank you.